Okay, thank you for joining us today to talk about handling open meetings and data practices now that the COVID-19 related statewide Chapter 12 emergency has ended. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Data Practices Office is a small office in the Department of Administration, and we're a statewide resource on data practices and the open meeting law. Most of what we do is respond to questions related to those laws from members of the public and government. We help the commissioner with issuing advisory opinions, and we also provide legislative assistance and training. This PowerPoint is posted to our website, so if you'd like to go back and take a look at it today, it is on the page where you registered. We also record our webinars, so if you missed part of today's webinar or want to go back and watch it again or find a webinar from one of our prior series, those are also posted on the Data Practices Office YouTube page. And I can show you how to find those videos on our website, which is the link on this slide. I'm going to share my screen here with you for just a moment. Okay, so you can always find our YouTube page in the footer right down here, or you can also go to our news and events menu up here and click on webinars. So on this page, you can actually find tips if you're having difficulty with your audio on this read the audio FAQs right here. And then you can also download any of the PowerPoints for any of our webinars right down here. And you can also access our YouTube channel from this page. And so I'm going to click on that right now. So you can find a lot of our past videos here on the YouTube channel, and the recording from today will be posted within the next couple of days or so. We also have videos on law enforcement data, personnel data, the open meeting law, social media, and several other topics. Okay, if you'd like to download a copy of today's PowerPoint slides, I'm going to share a file with you right now that you can download and save to your computer. Okay, so that file should be available to you now. I'll also share the slides near the end of the webinar for anyone who joins later or misses it this time around. A pop-up window should be on your screen right now, and you can select the file to download to your device. As I mentioned, this PowerPoint is also posted on our website right now, so you can grab a copy there as well. It's on the page where you registered for this webinar. Okay, for today's agenda, as you're all probably aware, the Minnesota legislature ended the statewide Chapter 12 emergency, which had been in place for more than a year, on July 1st. Our goal for today is to help you be prepared for possible changes to open meetings and data practices that your entity may need to implement now that the state of emergency is over. We'll start with some guidance and considerations for holding open meetings post-emergency, and then we'll spend some time discussing data practices issues that you may want to keep in mind going forward. Also, we'll have some time at the end for a Q&A session, and as you're sending in questions, please be sure to send those to all panelists to make sure that we can see them and then answer them at the end of the session here. One quick note before we get started, though. The legislature only ended the statewide Chapter 12 emergency declared by Governor Walz last year. However, municipalities and counties do have authority to declare local Chapter 12 emergencies. So it's very much possible that many people still have local emergencies in effect, which we'll discuss in the context of the open meeting law in just a little bit. But I just wanted to make sure to note that much of our discussion will be focused on the impacts of the statewide emergency that ended earlier this month. Okay, let's start with some considerations that public bodies will need to keep in mind now that the Chapter 12 emergency is over, as well as the requirements for holding remote meetings in non-emergency situations. Obviously, public bodies subject to the open meeting law must continue to meet the requirements of that law now that the statewide emergency is over, which was an obligation that also needed to be met while the emergency was ongoing. There's not a special provision in the open meeting law that provides a certain transition period from an emergency to a non-emergency. So now that the statewide Chapter 12 emergency has ended, all public bodies must be prepared to meet the applicable requirements of the open meeting law right away. Many of the requirements of the open meeting law remained in place throughout the emergency, such as holding meetings so that they are open to the public, adhering to the applicable notice requirements for regular, special, and emergency meetings, and closing meetings only in certain circumstances while explaining to the public why the meeting is being closed. Although the emergency has ended, there may still be some public bodies and their members who have concerns about safety and health, depending on their own unique circumstances. As we've noted in the past, there are different ways that public bodies, or some members of a public body, can meet remotely under the open meeting law, even though the statewide emergency ended on July 1st, so long as certain conditions are being met. So let's walk through some of those requirements and limitations of those options. Okay, we're going to start with Minnesota Statute Section 13D.015, which permits state-level entities to hold meetings by telephone or interactive technology, so long as certain conditions are met. Local public bodies, such as county commissions, city councils, or local school boards, for example, cannot use this section to hold meetings remotely. This section is reserved solely for state entities required to hold open meetings, such as the various state health licensing boards, professional licensing boards, and other public bodies, such as the Public Utilities Commission and the Minnesota Racing Commission, among others. So the conditions to hold a meeting under 13D.015 include all members of the participating entity must be able to hear all discussion and testimony, regardless of their physical locations. Next, all members of the public who are attending the meeting at the regular location must be able to hear all discussion and all votes of the entity's members. Additionally, members of the public must be able to participate in testimony when applicable. At least one member of the entity must be physically present at the regular meeting location. And then finally, all votes must be conducted by roll call. Beyond the required conditions to hold a 13D.015 meeting, state-level public bodies should also keep in mind some additional considerations when determining whether to hold meetings under this section. As an initial clarification, the legislature recently made changes to the open meeting law, including updating terminology from, quote, other electronic means to, quote, interactive technology. As part of this change, the legislature did define interactive technology as a device, software program, or other application that allows individuals in different physical locations to see and hear one another. So that definition is broad enough to cover programs like Skype, Zoom, WebEx, and Microsoft Teams. Technically, the amended terminology doesn't go into effect until August 1st, but from a practical standpoint, there aren't any new limitations with this updated language. Rather, the new language helps provide some flexibility to public bodies that account for updates in meeting tool technologies that might be used in the future. So really, if you are holding a meeting by interactive technology, that can include programs like Skype, Zoom, WebEx, and Microsoft Teams, or those other tools that you might want to use in order to meet remotely under 13D.015. Next, 13D.015 subdivision 4 requires that public bodies must, to the extent practical, allow the public to monitor the meeting remotely. This requirement could be met through providing links to watch the remote meeting via a computer or a personal device, or by providing dial-in information for a conference call. Finally, a state public body does need to post notice on its website that some members may be participating electronically at least 10 days in advance of a regular meeting. If it is a special or an emergency meeting, the public body must provide the electronic participation notice according to the applicable notice requirements under Minnesota statutes section 13D.04. So to recap the big highlights, only state-level entities can hold meetings by telephone or interactive technology under 13D.015, and there are some additional notice requirements that must be followed when state-level entities hold an open meeting when any member of the public body attends remotely. Okay, let's turn to Minnesota Statutes 13D.02, which permits public bodies to hold meetings by interactive technology so long as certain conditions are met. These conditions include all members must be able to hear each other as well as all discussion or testimony. Members of the public who are at the meeting location must be able to hear all discussion and testimony, as well as be able to hear all votes of the body's members. At least one member of the body must be physically present at the regular meeting location. Finally, each location where a member of the body is present must be open and accessible to the public. However, there are a couple of exceptions to this requirement. First, the location of the member doesn't need to be open to the public so long as the particular member has not participated remotely in a 13D.02 meeting from an inaccessible place more than 3 times, and the member is serving in the military and happens to be at a required drill, deployed, or on active duty. Alternatively, the member's location doesn't need to be open to the public so long as a member has not participated remotely in a meeting from an inaccessible place more than 3 times and has been told by a healthcare professional that they should not be in a public place because of medical or family reasons. This latter exception applies only when a Chapter 12 state of emergency had been declared and it expires 60 days after the emergency ends, which means this 60-day time period began back on July 2nd and will end on August 30th, 2021. One other quick note here. Earlier this year, the Minnesota legislature amended 13D.02 to clarify that this section does not apply to meetings of state-level bodies, meaning that Section 13D.02 applies only to local bodies such as school boards, city councils, and county commissions, among other local level bodies subject to the open meeting law. State bodies cannot use Section 13D.02 to hold a remote meeting. Rather, state bodies must meet the requirements of Section 13D.015 in order to meet remotely. This language takes effect on August 1st. Okay, let's briefly discuss some additional considerations that local public bodies need to keep in mind when holding an interactive technology meeting under Section 13D.02. First, as I described earlier, interactive technology would include any audio and video platforms, such as Zoom or Skype. However, Section 13D.02 does not permit telephone meetings, and the definition of interactive technology clearly states that it must be a device or software that permits members to, quote, see and hear one another. So using any devices or applications that are voice only, such as a telephone conference call system, would not be a permissible tool for local public bodies to hold meetings remotely. Next, any location where a member is attending remotely must be open to the public. Additionally, public bodies must provide notice of their regular meeting locations, as well as the locations where any members will be participating remotely. However, there are those exceptions that the locations of members who are participating remotely due to military service or for the listed medical reasons don't need to be noticed or open to the public. So it's these two requirements of members' locations being noticed and open to the public that may create challenges for local public bodies that want to continue to meet remotely now that the Chapter 12 emergency has ended. In other words, when a local public body is holding a remote meeting under Section 13D.02, the body must inform the public of the locations where all members will be, and those locations must be open to the public. For example, if a city council is holding a meeting using interactive technology under Section 13D.02, and some city council members want to attend via computer while at home, then those locations would need to be included in the meeting notice and be open to any members of the public who wanted to attend from that location. Certainly, this is an option, but my guess is that most public body members would be hesitant to open private locations to the public in this way. To be clear, public bodies are only required to notice these locations if a member of the body attends remotely. No additional location information needs to be provided about any members who attend the meeting in person at a regular meeting location. In short, local public bodies really need to think carefully about where members are located if members want to attend a meeting remotely under Section 13D.02, because those remote locations must be noticed and open to the public. Finally, Section 13D.02 does require local bodies to allow the public to monitor any interactive technology meetings remotely. In other words, if any members of the public body are attending remotely, you should also take reasonable steps to provide the public with the ability to attend the meeting remotely too. Okay, at this point, I imagine most public bodies are familiar with the requirements of holding meetings under Minnesota statutes, Section 13D.021, but let's just walk through them as a brief refresher. First, the presiding officer, chief legal counsel, or chief administrative officer for the body must determine that an in-person meeting of members of the public body is not practical or prudent because of a health pandemic or Chapter 12 emergency. Again, this is the threshold requirement for whether your body should hold meetings under this section. In other words, you need to determine whether it is safe for the public body's members to meet in person at a regular meeting location. If a quorum of the body can meet in person, then you should not be meeting under section 13D.021. Second, members of the body must be able to hear each other as well as all discussion or testimony. Next, members of the public who are attending at the regular meeting location must be able to hear all discussion. Also, at least one member, the chief legal counsel or the chief administrative officer of the public body, must be physically present at the regular meeting location. However, both of these requirements are contingent on whether attendance at the regular meeting location is feasible due to the health pandemic or emergency declaration. Finally, all votes must be taken by roll call. So let's discuss some additional considerations when it comes to section 13D.021 now that the Chapter 12 emergency is over. The first consideration is the language in subdivision 1, paragraph 1, that requires the public body to determine that an in-person meeting or other type of remote meeting is, quote, not practical or prudent because of a health pandemic or an emergency declared under Chapter 12. Obviously, the Chapter 12 emergency declared by Governor Walz in 2020 has ended, so you can no longer justify holding a meeting under section 13D.021 on the basis of a statewide emergency being in place. However, as I mentioned earlier, Chapter 12 does permit officials in municipalities and counties to declare local emergencies for limited periods of time. So it is possible that some local bodies could continue to hold meetings under Section 13D.021 if a local Chapter 12 emergency has been declared. Additionally, the language in Section 13D.021 indicates that public bodies are able to determine that an in-person meeting is still not practical or prudent due to a health pandemic. The open meeting law does not define or describe who determines whether a pandemic is ongoing. So, public bodies probably have some flexibility to determine whether to hold a telephone or interactive technology meeting under 13D.021 now that the statewide Chapter 12 emergency has ended. Public bodies will certainly want to consider the COVID-19 conditions where they typically meet when considering this option. And we recommend that a body makes a clear determination on the record or adopt some type of resolution that clarifies and gives clear reasons why an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent due to the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, the public body may want to refer to the guidance that is being provided by the Minnesota Department of Health and its determinations of whether the COVID-19 pandemic remains ongoing to help make decisions about meeting under Section 13D.021. Other considerations that you should keep in mind when it comes to holding meetings under this section are that public bodies must, to the extent practical, permit the public to monitor meetings electronically from a remote location. Public bodies must still adhere to the applicable notice requirements of Section 13D.04, and the notices must include the fact that some members of the public body may be attending remotely, as well as include information about how the public can also attend the meeting remotely. Finally, a new change that is going into effect on August 1st is that public bodies must provide members of the public, to the extent practical, with the ability to provide public comment from a remote location if the public body's practice was to permit public comments during in-person meetings. So in other words, if your body or entity permitted the public to provide comments at in-person meetings prior to the pandemic, you are obligated to find practical ways that would permit the public to provide comments during remote meetings held under Section 13D.021. Okay, let's take a few minutes to walk through some recent questions that our office has received about meetings post-emergency. So, for the first question, can a public body provide a live broadcast of a meeting for the public as a substitute for allowing the public to attend in person? The answer to this question is no, and the Commissioner addressed a similar issue in Advisory Opinion 21-003. In that situation, a quorum of school board members gathered in person for its meetings and cited 13D.021 as the reason why members of the public were limited to only attending remotely. The commissioner determined that the school board had not complied with the open meeting law, specifically noting that there is not currently a mechanism in the open meeting law that would permit a public body to hold in-person meetings while restricting public attendance to remote monitoring. In other words, if a quorum of public body members are meeting in person, then the meeting's location must be open to the public. So another question we've heard is what to do if a public body wants to hold a meeting where all members are attending in person and there are no limitations for public attendance, but the body wants to use technology to broadcast the meeting to anyone in the public who wants to attend the meeting remotely. Do the remote meeting requirements under sections 13D.015, 13D.02, or 13D.021 apply in this type of situation? Again, the answer to this question is no. The open meeting law doesn't create any special requirements if a public body voluntarily chooses to provide options for the public to monitor normal meetings remotely, whether it's through some sort of web broadcast or other type of audio or visual technology. The requirements of 13D.015, 13D.02, and 13D.021 apply only in situations when members of the public body will attend a meeting remotely. Offering a streaming option for the public to attend meetings remotely is a nice option that may provide access for many more people, but it does not create any additional legal obligations for the public body when all members are meeting in person. Okay, question 3. Can a public body limit the number of members of the public who are able to attend an in-person meeting? We've seen this question a few times, especially as public bodies are looking to begin in-person meetings once again, while also ensuring that there's enough space for physical distancing for anyone who still has health and safety concerns related to COVID-19. So with this question, there's not a clear answer one way or the other because the open meeting law is silent on whether a public body can limit the number of members from the public who may attend a meeting. Rather, the law simply states that meetings must be open to the public. In other words, the open meeting law doesn't have specific language that permits or prohibits public bodies from limiting public attendance at a meeting to a certain number of people for health and safety reasons. And just as a reminder, Minnesota courts do regularly note that the open meeting law should be, quote, construed in favor of public access. So our general guidance is that public bodies should be very careful in restricting public attendance. Any restrictions on attendance that a public body may create should be as limited as possible and reasonable within the context of the situation. Some considerations to take into account might include whether there are large spaces that a meeting could possibly be moved to, such as a community center, gymnasium, or other large space that could accommodate more people who can be physically distanced. Whether there are topics on the meeting agenda that will raise substantial interest by the public. It's probably less reasonable to limit attendance in situations when you know many people will want to attend a meeting to discuss a controversial agenda item. Whether you've taken steps for the public to attend the meeting in other ways, such as setting up overflow rooms for the public to attend near the meeting location. Whether you've sufficiently informed the public in advance that attendance may be limited. Whether you are providing alternative ways for the public to be informed about business conducted by the public body. So this isn't an exhaustive list by any means. These are merely some, excuse me, these are merely some considerations that public bodies should keep in mind to ensure that the meeting is as accessible as possible to the public if the body believes limiting in-person attendance is necessary out of concerns for health and safety. Again, such limitations should only be considered in very limited circumstances. Okay, one more question before turning to data practices issues and your questions. Are there any legislative changes to the open meeting law that public bodies should know about for remote meetings? The answer is yes. The legislature made several tweaks to the open meeting law during the regular legislative session this year, and those changes are in Chapter 14 of this year's session laws. I've already highlighted most of the changes to remote meetings, such as updating language to interactive technology, limits on which public bodies can hold different types of meetings, and new public comment requirements for remote meetings held during an emergency. There are a few other general changes related to the Journal of Votes that will go into effect on August 1st, which we will cover more during our legislative update webinar next week. I've included the link to the session law on this slide, so you can take a look at the exact language and the changes that the legislature made to the open meeting law during this 2021 regular session. And again, as I mentioned, we'll be hosting the legislative update webinar next week to walk through the changes to the open meeting law. You can sign up for that webinar on the Data Practices Office website. Okay, let's take a few minutes to talk about data practices post-emergency before taking a look at some of your questions. Please feel free to keep sending questions in through the Q&A panel, and remember to send the questions to all panelists to ensure that we see them. As we discussed throughout the emergency, the obligations that government entities have under the Data Practices Act remained the same because Chapter 13 does not contain any emergency provisions or measures. In general, the Data Practices Act already has some flexibility built into the law when it comes to responding to requests to access public data, but the 10 business day deadline remained for requests from data subjects. Although the obligations remained the same, it's probably fair to say that your entity changed or altered some of its data request processes and procedures over the past year or so. Now that the emergency has ended, it may be a good opportunity to review some of those changes to determine whether your entity should implement them permanently. Your entity will also want to make sure that it is memorializing any updates or changes to data practices, processes, and procedures within your data access policies for the public and for data subjects. As a reminder, the Data Practices Act requires that these policies be updated annually by August 1st, or as necessary to reflect changes in personnel, procedures, or other circumstances that may impact the ability to access data. So right now is a great opportunity to consider ways that your processes and procedures could have or may have improved over the past year, and then write those changes into your current policies. With the statewide emergency now behind us, your entity should also be thinking about how you might handle requests for access, particularly in relation to requests for in-person inspection. Obviously, the safety and health of both the public and government staff remain a priority, and you'll want to assess what in-person inspection might reasonably look like at your entity. There are probably several different ways that your entity could provide the opportunity for in-person inspection, such as providing inspection in large conference rooms that provide plenty of physical distancing, or finding reasonable times to permit inspection when fewer people may be in the building. Additionally, whether staff are available to facilitate in-person inspection will be another consideration. Different entities will be on different timelines when it comes to staff returning to the office and operating at pre-pandemic capacities. And many entities may implement a hybrid work environment where staff are in the office some days while working virtually other days. Obviously, in-person inspection does require some staff to be present and available in an office, so you may want to take this into account as you're planning the return to office for staff. As we mentioned last year, waiving fees for copies or data may also be one way to provide reasonable access to data in lieu of in-person inspection. It's not required, but providing free copies may help facilitate data requests as entities transition back to the office. And just to clarify, there is no exception to the inspection requirements in the Data Practices Act. So your entity does need to have ways to accommodate requests for inspection, even though staff may be working remotely or not regularly in person at the office. I think the best guidance that we can give is to make sure that you are communicating with data requesters as your processes for handling inspection and access to copies evolve. Requesters may be asking for data from many different entities that are making data available through fairly different procedures. Communicating with the requesters about your processes and procedures can set some clearer expectations and help to head off any possible problems. And just a few final thoughts here on data security obligations under the Data Practices Act. The obligation to protect private and confidential data have remained ongoing throughout the emergency. So you'll want to have processes in place to ensure that any data that employees may have taken home or to another offsite location are safely returned to the office. especially if it was not public data. Right now may also be a good opportunity to review your data protection processes and conduct some staff training on ensuring that not public data remains secure. You may also want to consider procedures for handling not public data if your entity is taking a hybrid approach when it comes to returning to work, where employees will work at the office and at home throughout the week. Again, the Data Practices Act doesn't specifically dictate how your entity's data security procedures should operate. Rather, the law simply requires government entities to have some type of procedures in place, which means each entity has flexibility to determine what procedures work best for its staff, and you will want to make sure those procedures are documented in the appropriate policies. Okay, so now we're going to open it up for your questions, so please feel free to keep sending those in. Again, if you have a question, please send it to all panelists in the Q&A panel. If we don't get to your question during the webinar, we will follow up with you afterward. I'm also going to make the PowerPoint slides available again while we are taking your questions, so you can download them if you missed them the first time around. And the slides are also available on our website right now if you'd like to download them there. It's in the same spot where you registered for the webinar. If you do hear a pause or a silence during the Q&A, don't worry, your audio is still probably working, and we're just making sure that we get to all the questions. So certainly please keep sending them in.
Okay, so we have a few questions here. First question is, can the remote location be outside the local jurisdiction's area? And so I think that this might be referring to the 13D02 meetings. The Commissioner of Administration issued an advisory opinion related to this question in 2018. It's advisory opinion 18-019. And in this opinion, a public body member wanted to know if they could attend a meeting remotely under 13D.02, so through interactive television, which is now other electronic means, from Florida. And in that opinion, the commissioner discussed the Quast case and came to the conclusion that a member of the board could participate in board meetings while out of state via ITV under 13D02 as long as the other conditions of that section were met. And so, meaning the location had to be open and accessible to the public, and they must provide that notice that's required in 13D02 subdivision 4. So again, that is advisory opinion 18-019, and it also references the Quast case.
Another question we have is how many days notice is required under 13D.02? So again, 13D.02 is meetings by interactive technology for local public bodies. So for local public bodies, you are going to want to take a look at 13D.04. 13D.04 sets out the timing and the method of notice. It's going to depend on the type of meeting that you are having. The law does not require you local public bodies to put things on websites or social media. Having said that, it is a helpful and useful practice, especially when you're having a remote meeting, to not only follow 13D.04, which is somewhat antiquated, but also to provide notice in other ways by means of links and whatnot. Again, social media, websites, not required for local public bodies, but helpful for your members of the public. So take a look at 13D.04. We also have a 4-part series of the open meeting law basics on our YouTube channel that goes through all of those notice requirements as well. Another question we had was, if a commissioner, I'm guessing county, commissioner decides to attend remotely from their home, and that has to be open to the public, how do we say the location if the personal addresses are considered private data? If the data, if the home addresses of your elected officials are considered private data, then and they want to attend from home, you might have to get their consent because notice will need to be provided to the public, and that the meeting has to be open to the public. The location has to be open to the public. So if a commissioner wants to do that, they may need to provide consent if their address is private data.
Another question that asks, after 60 days have passed, does a member need the medical professional statement to attend remotely? So I think this is referring to 13D02 and the exception to have that remote meeting location open to the public. So there's that health exception within that expires 60 days after the state of emergency ends. And once that 60 days passes, this exception to having your remote location open to the public expires. And so after those 60 days, if somebody wants to attend remotely via 13D02, they have to follow those requirements to have their remote location open to the public and the additional notice requirements.
All right, a specific question from Soil, Water, and Conservation District boards, but generally would apply to local public bodies. Can an SWCD board member have members attend remotely as long as a quorum is present on site? And does their remote vote still count? So if any members of a public body, a local public body, are attending remotely, then you are in section 13D.02 and you need to meet all the requirements of that section. That section says that each member of a public body participating in a meeting by interactive television, or now interactive technology, is considered present at the meeting for purposes of determining quorum and participating in all meetings. So as long as you have met all those standards, everybody can see and hear, you're doing roll call votes. Certainly the the public body member who is attending remotely, any of them can still vote.
Okay, we've got a question here where someone said that they were told that they have to post agendas within 72 hours prior to the meeting. And then what exactly is needed for the 10 days in advance notice. And then additionally, under additional considerations for 13D.021, it listed 13D.04 notices are required. What does that notice entail? So just kind of answering these in order. So there is not any requirement in the open meeting law that you have to post an agenda a certain amount of time beforehand. Certainly, it's probably a good practice for public bodies to do so, just so people in the public know what may be addressed or discussed at that meeting. And then what exactly is needed for the 10 days in advance? That requirement is in 13D.015. And so those are meetings by telephone or by interactive technology that are held by state level public bodies. Those bodies need to post on their website 10 days in advance of a meeting that some members may be attending by telephone or by interactive technology. And so that notice does need to be posted on the website. And then the 13D.04 notices, that's the section that basically lays out the notice of meeting requirements and everything like that. And so those are the notices for regular meetings, special meetings, and emergency meetings. We do have some more information about those requirements and those guidelines because they differ a little bit. You can find that in our open meeting law webinar series on our YouTube page.
Another question is, are staff considered members of the public body to meet the requirement to have one person physically present, or does it need to be a board member? And so this likely depends on the language that's used in each of the remote provisions. Generally, a public body member means one of the voting members in the public body. And so with 13D.021 as an example, that section distinguishes between members of the public body and then other members or other individuals who work for the government entity, such as the presiding officer, chief legal counsel, or chief administrative officer, and says that either of those individuals or a public body member can be at the remote or at the regular meeting location. And so in that statute, they specifically list other individuals. For provisions that don't list somebody other than a public body member, that could lean in favor of interpreting that as it's just the public body member that should be in person.
Okay, and we have a question about 13D.021 and the continued use of 13D.021 now that the statewide Chapter 12 emergency has ended. And the question is, there is a White House continuation of the COVID-19 national emergency that was dated February 24th, 2021. couldn't presiding officer, chief legal counsel, chief administrative officer rely on the national pandemic declaration for purposes of 13D.021 and therefore continue meeting under that provision? And of course, that section doesn't tell us what it says. The plain language of that section says that the threshold question and determination is whether it is not practical or prudent because of a health pandemic or an emergency declared under Chapter 12. So there are two different choices there. There's a health pandemic or a Chapter 12 emergency. So now there's no longer the statewide Chapter 12 emergency. Some local public bodies may still have a Chapter 12 emergency. But the other option is whether there is a health pandemic. So I do think that every public body will have to decide for itself whether it continues to be a health pandemic, and certainly using that guidance from the White House is an option for public bodies to consider.
Another question, does the Data Practices Office track proposed legislative changes to Chapter 13 for next session? And does DPO suggest changes for more efficient application of the Data Practices Act? We do generally track legislative changes, and we are actually going to have a legislative update webinar in a couple weeks with the changes that occurred this legislative session. And so we'll be doing that again next legislative session, or at least tracking them. We'll see about the webinar and feedback we get from that. And we usually post those legislative changes in our newsletter that comes out in the summer. And so that actually just went out, and there will be a copy that's posted on our website as well. As far as our office, suggesting legislative changes, as far as our office suggesting, as far as our office suggesting legislative changes, we don't generally advocate for one position or another with Data Practices Act and policy changes, because we generally try to stay neutral as we assist both members of the public, government, and media.
Okay, I'm gonna hop in here. We probably have time for just a couple more questions. And as these questions are going on, I'm actually gonna open a poll to give us some feedback about how the webinar went today. So if you could fill that out, that really helps our office know what's going on. And then we'll still answer a few questions here. But if you take a couple of minutes to let us know how we did today, that would be great.
All right, and we have a question. We talked a little bit about this before, but just to clarify, the question is under 13D.015. So again, 13D.015 is for state level public bodies. The single person present at the physical location of a meeting can be the public body's executive director, ? The statute does not require that at least one voting member of the public body be present at the physical location. That's the question. Yes, so for 13D.015, the language in the statute says a member of the entity, not a member of the body. And so for state level public body members, it can be somebody who is it could be a voting member, it could be somebody who's part of the entity staff for the public body as well.
Okay, so we have another question here that if we live stream our meeting, is there a requirement that we keep the recording? And is there any guidance how long we would have to keep the archive? So this is a really great question. The open meeting law doesn't really describe what to do in situations where you maybe record a regular meeting or a remote meeting where people are in their normal attendance. There are some requirements to record closed meetings under section 13D.05. And so if you are just recording a normal open meeting, then I think it's really up to you to decide how long that you keep that, and then how long that would be on your retention schedule. One other thing I would want to add about recording your normal meetings is that under 13D.05, it does say that a record of the meeting, regardless of its form, shall be public. And so when you are recording that meeting, the recording of that would be public. And there's a little bit more of a discussion about this, and especially if perhaps some not public data was discussed during that open session, You can find that in Advisory Opinion 21-002, and there's some good guidance in there about handling recordings and what that section means. And so if you are live streaming a meeting and recording it, there's not a specific requirement for how long you should keep it, and you should probably, look at your records retention schedule to determine how long to keep that. Okay, it is 1:45 p.m. and so we're going to be wrapping up the webinar here today because that's about all of the time that we have scheduled. And so the survey is already open, so if you could fill out that survey and just let us know how we did and give us some feedback, that would be great. Also, if we didn't get to your question today, we will be sure to follow up with you. Remember that you can go back to the recording if you want to revisit any of the presentation or the Q&A. Our recording of this webinar will be on the YouTube page probably within the next couple of days. And just as a reminder, we'll be hosting another webinar next week about legislative changes related to data practices and the open meeting law. You can sign up for that next webinar on our website. Thank you.